Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I have the pleasure today to welcome you to the 2022 Global Spark Thought Leader Panel on Decarbonizing the Planet. My name is Catherine Bancroft. I'm a Managing Director at Global Spark and an Associate at the Boston Consulting Group. And with me today to introduce and close out our panel is the Global Spark founder and strategy consultant at X, Malik Ishmael, and fellow Managing Director at Global Spark and University of Toronto engineering science student, Julia Che. Before diving into today's panel, firstly, I want to give a big shout out to the full team behind pulling together this incredible event. It truly is a team effort, and all the people on this page have done an amazing job at pulling all of this together. I also want to take this opportunity to thank our long-term partner, the Boston Consulting Group, and with them, Kate Banting, for their continued support for Global Spark. Here's what you can expect from us for the next 90 minutes of the panel. We'll start off with a brief introduction of the organization behind this all before handing the mic to our moderator, Hina Zuzek-Arden, who will explain the current state of decarbonization. We'll then get right into the panel discussion. Please feel free to submit questions as we go along. There should be a question function in your Zoom webinar, and we'll have 30 minutes at the end to address questions and key themes that emerge. Now handing over to Malik to introduce Global Spark.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And thank you everyone for being here today. We're really excited for today's discussion, and we hope you are too. Now, the panel that we're running today is really an embodiment of what we're trying to achieve here at Global Spark. When I was in university, the one question I had lingering on my mind was, how do I take what I've learned in engineering and have a positive impact on the world? I had studied engineering at the time, but wherever I looked, I couldn't easily find any guidance or experiences that would help me answer that question or test certain hypotheses that I had. And so that's really what we're trying to solve as an organization. So we really have two goals. One is to help you determine how your skills can be applied in your careers to make a positive impact on the world and what you specifically can do. And then the second is to connect you with both other young, passionate leaders from around the world, but also experts from leading fields and other disciplines who can help you guide you on that journey. So if we just move to the next slide, Catherine. So how exactly do we do that? Well, we know that folks learn in different ways. And so what we do is we try to create these first of their kind experiences for both professionals and students, not only to get answers to these two questions I just listed, but to also give you a platform to accelerate your impact. And so we do that in 5 ways. The first, of course, is the speaker panel, which you are all attending here today, which is one of our flagship experiences. We found that when it comes to innovation and social impact, most conversations are targeted at leaders today, but not to the leaders of tomorrow. And so that's what we're really trying to solve with this type of conversation. We want to bring in experts from around the world to talk to you about what is the cutting edge thinking in their worlds and kind of guide you along your journeys. We also have a leading multidisciplinary social impact hackathon around the world called Hack the Globe, where we partner with BCG and Google, the World Food Program, Save the Children, and 20 other organizations to really give folks a platform to build and incubate ideas and connect with venture capital funds to actually see them through. We also work with universities around the world to build curriculum around the Sustainable Development Goals. We have a podcast that we connect with executives from different fields and discuss their career paths and impact. And of course, we partner with many local organizations as well to create local experiences for folks. If we can move to the next slide, please, Kat. Now, as Catherine mentioned, this is very much a team effort. And so our team is comprised of more than 100 young professionals and students from around the world who volunteer their time to really creating this movement of social impact globally. And just like our multidisciplinary mission, our team comes from a variety of backgrounds. So on the professional side, we have folks in consulting from BCG, Bain, McKinsey. We have folks who have done tech, ranging from Google and Google X to DeepMind and Microsoft. We have folks who are in finance and who work at some of the world's largest funds like CPPIB. On the student side, we have team members from a wide range of institutions. You'll mostly see Canadian and American institutions because up until last year, we were primarily based in North America. But we're really excited as a team to make our experiences and opportunities global. And of course, we're growing. So over the past 5 years, we've grown from a team of just one to a team of over 100. And we're planning on growing even more because we think we're really scratching the surface here. So whether you're a student or a young professional to be, we'd love to have you on our team. Applications will be opening over the next few days. So feel free to reach out to any of us and follow us on social media for any updates. Back to you, Kat.
So talking about global, the attendees for the panel today is a really global bunch spanning pretty much every continent, maybe with the exception of Antarctica on the page here. We think that this is very fitting for a pressing global topic like climate change and decarbonization. And we hope that today's conversation will serve as a point of connection amongst all of you, the future leaders of tomorrow. So now to kick off our panel with a recap on the current state of decarbonization, I'm thrilled to introduce our moderator, Tina Zuzek-Arden. Tina is a member of the Energy and Public Sector Practices at the Boston Consulting Group in the Washington, D.C. office. Her focus is strategy as it relates to climate change responses, especially when based on sustainability, renewables, and demand-side management. She leads the demand-side management in North America for the Boston Consulting Group and co-leads BCG's work with the US federal government on energy and climate change. Additionally, Tina has experience in driving greater infrastructure and power access in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, impacting energy accessibility at the global scale. As a graduate of Harvard Business School, she now works with public sector clients on defining baselines, adaptation, resiliency, emissions reduction plans, and broad-scale transformations of procurement and operations. We are incredibly excited to have you with us today, Tina, and now handing the mic over to you.
So before we kind of kick off our panel today, I wanted to just share a little bit with you all about the state of decarbonization and climate change today, if we could move to those slides. So today we're largely talking about decarbonization, and you've probably heard a few other terms here related to climate. So there is mitigation, which is kind of reducing or zeroing out emissions. And then there is adaptation and resilience, recognizing that even with mitigation, we will all feel and are feeling some effects from climate change already, and we need to adapt. This is especially important because the populations that are often feeling the biggest impacts of climate change are actually some of the most vulnerable. So what you see here is that the world's emissions are found heavily in a few sectors. But as you can probably tell, these are big sectors with huge impacts on the world economy. It's not so simple as just shutting down the power sector or some of the industrial goods that we need to run the economy. So it's important to understand, though, where our emissions come from so we know actually how to target ourselves to reduce them as we go forward. And we need to reduce them going forward. Next slide, please. So in order to keep global temperature increase to something that would prevent the most catastrophic impacts of climate change, we need to not only reverse the trend we are currently on, but dramatically cut emissions over the next couple decades. So next slide then. The problem is that is not exactly the path that we're on today. So as you can see here, our emissions have been largely growing over the past decades, and that, I mean, not including kind of the dip that we saw at the beginning of COVID, but our current trajectory doesn't suggest that that's the path we're on. So what this means is that we have more drastic action is needed much more quickly than it's happening today. Next slide, please. So let me just give you an example of what we're talking about here. So when we're talking about energy, it's about a multitude of levers that we need to pull. So from everything from shifting how we produce energy, so that's, you know, not using coal plants, but rather shifting to carbon-free sources like solar, as well as to how we consume energy. So moving from traditional cars with ICEs and shifting to electric vehicles, as well as consuming less of it via, say, energy efficiency. But all of those buckets of emissions that we talked about up front have these kind of level levers that we have to start pulling in a much, much more aggressive way if we're going to reduce kind of where the trajectory that we're on. Now, the exciting thing is we've got some experts here today who can talk to us about what are the things that give them optimism for having the world change the trajectory that it's on. So let's just jump into the panel objectives very quickly. So what we hope that you get out of this today is a deeper understanding of the current state of decarbonization, as well as energy justice and equity, and the challenges that are going to define the next decades here. Second thing is, we hope that it is exciting to you and inspiring, and we hope that you will explore kind of this area more for opportunities, how you can make an impact as well. And then third, an appreciation for how important it is for us all to work together across a variety of disciplines to actually make an impact here. So thank you all, and I'd love to jump into the panel and give our panelists a chance to introduce themselves. Paige, can you kick us off?
I can. Good morning. Morning from the West Coast here. I'm Paige Crahan, and I'm really happy to join you all today. Thank you so much to the host for facilitating this. We're really keen to share some of our insights and have a good dialogue. Today, I'm a director at Tapestry, which is X's moonshot for the electric grid, and X is an entity inside Alphabet. And we think about inventing and launching radical solutions that solve some of the world's biggest problems with breakthrough technology. And we're focusing on, obviously, the electric grid and carbon-free energy. And just before coming to X, I worked at a company called Sunrun, which is a residential solar energy company here in the US, and then did some energy investing. So I have been working in this space for a while, and I'm really keen to share some of our observations and talk to the rest of the panelists today. So I'll pass it on to Matt.
Hey everyone, I'm Matt Eggers. I'm happy to be on the panel today. Hopefully we can provide everyone with some good, useful input. I spent the first part of my career in biotech and made the shift to what was called clean tech or green tech back in 2006 and is now Climatetech, and spent 3 or 4 years each at Sunrun, and where Paige and I worked together, and Bloom Energy, and then Tesla, and then did some building energy efficiency software work, and was an angel investor along the way. And a few years ago, started investing full-time for Breakthrough Energy Ventures, where I cover transportation, the grid, buildings, and occasionally some other stuff. Happy to be here today.
Great, thanks all. And then Donnel is going to be joining us, but in a couple minutes. So we might just slowly get started and let him introduce himself when he actually joins us here. So maybe let's just get started then. Paige, let me start with you. You know, there are a number of things that need to go right to achieve net zero. So what do you see as the top area to focus on to help us get there?
Yeah, thank you, Tina. I think in good news, it feels like Matt spending a couple years in this space, we have some things going well for us right now. There seems to be a lot of finance available and interested in supporting this space. I think there's policy and regulatory support that perhaps wasn't in place a couple of years ago. So I think there are some great tailwinds. So in response to what is the biggest thing that I think still needs to be addressed, I think a lot about the business models and the ability to rapidly deploy the innovations that those technology, the finance and the sort of entrepreneurs are bringing forward into the world. And most specifically, when I think about the grid, because we're very risk-free, as we should be, we want to keep the lights on for everyone. We test and we pilot and we trial at generally sort of small scale for quite an extended period of time until we reach a high degree of comfort in that new technology or that new innovation or a new way of doing things. And my observation is that there needs to be a paradigm shift in the way we reach comfort with that new technology so that we're not doing extended small pilots. We just don't have the time anymore. So I have a lot of optimism about what's going well. And when I think about what I hope I see more focus on and what I think as one of the single biggest accelerants that could really bring this all forward, it's really around the business models and the deployment of what's underway so we can support the entrepreneurs and the technologies.
Great, thanks. And then Matt, I'll give you the same question then. Like, what would you say for you is the top area that you're focused on? Yeah.
Well, hard to, I don't have anything radically different than what Paige said. Although I would say we do need government action We have come a long way. There was on the point of we've come a long way, there was a great Twitter thread maybe 2 years ago or so that was the longest Twitter thread I've ever seen on so-called climate Twitter or energy Twitter, which you can sum up with RCP 8.5 is bollocks, which if you're not familiar with English slang, bollocks means, phony or BS or not real. So I think, we're off the line for the absolute worst case. But the middle cases that we are still heading to are really bad. They're not like complete destruction of civilization, but they're not good. So we've got a lot of work to do. We're off the worst case, which is great. 5-10 years ago, I wasn't sure we'd get there. In the meantime, we do need really significant government action. This is just a massive problem that's going to require, hundreds and hundreds of billions spent per year in order to keep temperatures below 2 degrees. And we're not spending that right now. And I think probably the only way to completely shift us to spending that is some significant government action. In the meantime, I think there's this debate sometimes that also happens on places like Twitter and panels and so forth about innovation versus deployment. Maybe we'll touch on that later. And I think we need both. And, innovation is an area where myself and my partners in our firm are heavily engaged, supporting new companies that are innovating. And we need both because we don't have a solution for cement or steel, which, are themselves responsible for 12-13% of emissions, for example. And there's all kinds of other things. We don't have a solution for heating buildings. We don't have a solution for aviation. So, you can quickly get to some very large portion of emissions that we don't have any plan yet for. So the things that we do know, like we need a lot of clean energy, we should be deploying like crazy. In these other areas, we really need to continue to innovate so that once we do have all the financing lined up and the government action, we can deploy those solutions very quickly too.
And Matt, on that, are there a couple innovations that you are most excited about as you kind of scan the market and look at where you all want to invest to? Are there areas where you think there's real promise?
There are. Gosh, there's so many, Tina. I mean, that's sort of like asking me to pick my favorite child, except in this case, I've got, I don't know what our portfolio is, 95 children. So with all apologies to all 95 of them, I'll highlight a couple of special areas. One is cement, because it is such a big intractable problem. Cement and water are the materials that we as humans move the most. There is an enormous amount of cement. Practically everything we do depends on it, and it's incredibly carbon intensive. And we've got some exciting things in our portfolio there, and ranging from companies that are really active in the market and deploying a lot, that are reducing emissions 10 to 20%. Which doesn't sound like much, but across the massive volume of cement, that's huge. And others that are much bigger shots at reducing the amount of emissions from cement, mostly or completely. So that's one exciting area. Another one is aviation. Aviation is normally attributed to having 2.5% of emissions. So it's a very large problem, not one of the handful of absolute biggest. But when you count non-CO2 forcing, all the other things that happen when we have airplanes in the sky, like cirrus cloud formation and NOx at altitude, it gets up to about 5 to 7% of emissions, and it's the fastest growing. I feel like it's something that we really want people to have more of. It brings the world closer, which is a good thing for civilization. And some exciting things happening there too, with electrics and hybrids and hydrogen in aviation. And gosh, I could go on, Tina. So maybe I'll stop there and you can come back to those if you want more specific areas.
Perfect. And maybe, Paige, let me ask you the same question then. How are you thinking about, what are some of the innovations that you are most excited about that you want to tell people about?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is it's important that we find optimism, because this is such a heavy subject. And as Matt said, the trajectory is a little scary if you want to read into where we're headed. I do think finding some areas of optimism is so important, and there are great things happening. I think three of the, I will say, and maybe instead of technologies, trends that I'm excited about seeing us embrace are kind of the coupling. So I think about energy a lot, but we're also talking about, as Matt touched on, transportation. that's electrifying. We're talking about manufacturing that's kind of thinking about their energy sources differently from mining to steel and cement. We're thinking about supply chains. And I think the way that we embrace the fact that this is a system of systems problem, you don't just, when you solve one, it impacts another one, and how do they all connect together, is incredibly exciting. It's hard, but it's exciting. So the system of systems notion and the coupling with other sectors is really great to see folks coming together. I see grid folks talking to car manufacturing folks, which normally would have never been a conversation that you're having, and what could come from that. I think good things. The second thing is the proliferation of just information and data. And it's hard to manage risk and change when you're blind. And so I think when we have more information about whether it's data around what's happening for weather generation to predict what's happening in our wind and solar production, or just understanding temperature and trends, I think embracing the fact that we have better information about the built world means we can make better decisions. And I'm really excited about what that trend can unlock for entrepreneurs and for innovators and the way we manage risk. So I think the two things I'm most excited about are the ability to take the proliferation of information and data and sensing and enable us to make better decisions there. And then secondly, the system of systems thinking and how that can unlock.
Well, and Paige, let me ask you a question to follow up on a point that Matt made around, there's this question of innovation, and is that, a key area of focus, or is it deploying what we've got and making sure we get that out to the market faster than we are today? How do you think about that deployment versus innovation kind of balance?
I wish I'm not a lawyer, but I want to say it depends, and that's a good lawyer answer, I think. But I think the answer is, if we just spent all of our energy innovating and we had all these wonderful things, we would not solve the problem, because I think that's where we get into this kind of pilot issue where we've proven it in one place a few times, but that is not like it's not fast enough to address this problem. And so I think you have to have innovation, but without, and then on the deployment side, I think if we just deployed the technology we have today, we would make in a faster manner, in a far accelerated manner, we would make incredible strides. So I think the issue that I really want to help unlock is this kind of move from piloting and proving to faster deployment, so that when innovation happens, it's deployed more rapidly. So I think we can make, if we had to pick one, each focusing just on either would be massive accelerants. But the true unlock in my mind is, how do we bring the innovations into the world more quickly? Because I think we get, it's hard. As a former, as an entrepreneur, you build something that's wonderful, and it's really hard to build a business if you can't make money on those couple of years of innovation and learnings. You need to be able to start selling it and deploying it, and not in a protracted sales cycle that takes 2 years to make $1. So I think it's both the deployment and innovation. As Matt said, we have big things to tackle that require innovation that don't have solutions. So we certainly need to focus on both.
Matt, would you agree? Is that kind of how you think about it too?
Yeah, absolutely. I think about it as both. We've got all kinds of great solutions that instead of investing, 50 or 100 billion in a year, we should be doubling or tripling or quadrupling that. Things like electric vehicles and solar and wind on the grid, are probably the two that come to most mind for me. And nuclear. If I was king of the world, I'd be deploying a lot of nuclear and investing a huge amount in both fission and fusion and other techniques. But I really think it's a false dichotomy, which kind of frustrates me when it takes over the debate, because I'm not sure that there's anybody out there in the world who's thinking, gosh, I've got all these decisions and all this money, and I'm just gonna pour it on innovation and not deploy anything. That's just not happening. You could argue that governments could make that kind of mistake. But I think if governments put in place the kind of incentives that most folks in the community wanted, like take a carbon tax or a clean energy standard or so forth, as long as they're market neutral, that will both spur deployment and innovation. And, you could say too, like, well, solar, we just need to deploy. Yes, but if there was an even bigger market for solar, that would encourage innovators to drive down the cost of solar. And no matter how much you think solar could be deployed, if I asked you, I've got an invention that will cut the cost of solar deployment by 50%. Do you think we should deploy that? I don't think any of the deployment folks would be like, nah, we got this. Don't cut the cost of solar by 50% with your cool new technology. Please, no. We've got it covered. That's just nonsensical. So in all these areas, I hope that we really continue to spur and encourage the great engineers and thinkers and builders out in the world and across the landscape to innovate. I guess then the last thing that I'll say is echoing, I guess, maybe or extending what Paige said about this is a systems problem. Everything matters. Every dollar that every single person on this phone call and every business that they interact with and every business in the world generates emissions. So, the food you eat, if you rode your bike this morning, you were generating emissions, unless like you were a local farm holder and very carefully planting the food you ate in your backyard. So we've got to fix it all. And so, I really like to encourage people to think about whatever their interest is, every single thing that we do, we need to innovate around to make it more efficient. And of course, there are the big things like cement and row crops and aviation and cars and so forth, but there are all the tiny small things that we do too that we need to innovate around and deploy to solve this problem.
It's an and, not an or.
It's an
right?
and,
yeah.
A really, really big capital and.
Well, and so, we're talking about how the whole system has to work together to kind of attack a problem this monumental. We talked a little bit about the optimistic side, or what are the innovations and stuff that we have going that might really help solve this. There's also the other side of it, which is what are the roadblocks that are preventing us from doing some of that today? And so would love to hear from you guys. What are some of those roadblocks that you've seen that not only do we have to work on the innovations, but we also have to work on removing some of these roadblocks that are there preventing us from making as much progress as we want to be? Paige, anything come to mind for you that are some of those more problematic areas?
Yeah, and I don't know if it's a roadblock, but it's a reality. So I'm again thinking in the context of electricity system here, but where there is incredible will to make change and to decarbonize, and you have the technology, you still have the physical reality of what you're doing. And I'll give you an example that sticks in my mind of a problem that I think about all day is, we've been working a little bit with folks in Chile who are trying to decommission coal plants at an accelerated rate. Fantastic, right? 2 thumbs up, get the coal offline. But they have no replacement that can keep the system at the level of stability that it needs to be, because the reality is wind isn't as consistent as coal. Coal is, you can control when you dispatch and the availability. It's not clean, but from a physics perspective, keeping the lights on, it makes the jobs easier of the grid. One example, we see the challenges in Texas about a year and a half ago when they had a sustained blackout of the electric grid, and a lot of that is the physics of the system replacing well understood, readily available, albeit dirty generation with variable, weather dependent, intermittent generation is really hard physics wise. And so to me, one of the biggest challenges and opportunities or blockers is how do we get enough information and have enough tools to be able to make those changes where the kind of, shall we say, reliable fossil generation can be replaced by more variable weather-driven generation and maintain stability. So batteries and storage are great, but they're pretty short duration. And so I think when I think about the blockers, that's one that kind of, so to say, keeps me up at night, is like, even if there is the government policy, the finance, the innovation, how do we actually balance and keep the physics of a very dynamic system? A system where demand changes quickly, a system where supply changes quickly. As you were saying, Tina, at the beginning, when each sides of that are more dynamic, it makes keeping the system safe and stable really hard. And at the end of the day, energy and all the things we're talking about, food and transportation, they're essential services for humans. So we need to make sure that we keep quality high. And so that's something that kind of keeps me up at night, that I'd love to figure out how to magic wand and unblock.
No, and I think that's a really elegant description of some of the issues with the grid. And Matt, what about you from a non-grid perspective? What are some of those roadblocks that are most concerning to you?
Yeah, Paige touched on some of the mega trends there, like skills, risk, disruption, and maybe I'll pick on a couple of areas that the other areas that those show up. One is in buildings. So, it's difficult to renovate buildings for various reasons. One is disruption to the people that live there or work there. Another is, the amount of time and of payback of those investments that real estate is accustomed to. It's different than in some other industries like the grid, for example. And the last one is, some of these things get so technocratic, but it's the split incentive problem, where a landlord might pay for the infrastructure in the building, but tenants pay for the power. So, the landlord doesn't have an incentive to make the building more efficient because it's not going to benefit them because the tenants are paying for that power. So there are some of these things are market failure and some are, technology failures. Another area that's interesting that highlights skills, and the skills comes into buildings too, where ground source heat pumps are really effective ways in certain places to reduce residential heating. In Europe is so much better at installing these things than we are. There's nothing different about the technology. They've been doing it a lot more. They have better drills and better skills than we do to do the exact same thing. And so, we've got a portfolio company that's learning a lot from them and bringing that over and pretty rapidly reducing the cost of ground source heat pumps, just by bringing completely known processes to a different place. But then, another area where this happens is farming. So rice is one of the largest single GHG problems we have. And that comes mostly from methane. Rice is, you've all seen either rice paddies live or in movies or something, and it's grown in flooded rice paddies primarily. And so all the parts of the plant below the water line rot, and they rot anaerobically, which releases methane. So, we're talking about a 2 to 4 gigaton problem, depending on what the timeline you look at for methane. It doesn't need to be grown that way. You can actually grow it in a different method with seeding without all that water, but it takes a different set of skills. And typically yields drop in the first year or two when farmers start trying that, and then they go up back to where they were as people get better at it. But only something like 5% of rice in the world is grown that way. So, how do we teach all those farmers who are providing the largest single source of calories in the world this different way of doing things without driving them out of business and, starving people on the planet in the meantime, when we know how to do it? So, that's another one that's hard to wrap your head around, the skills and the dissemination of those skills and techniques and equipment to make that happen.
No, that's a really good perspective, and I think a great global view too of what are some of the challenges that we face. And Donnel, I see that you're on now. Would love to bring you into this. It would be great if you could introduce yourself to everyone, and then we're talking now about what are some of the roadblocks that we face in actually deploying some of these exciting innovations and technologies and making an impact on decarbonization. And would just love to hear a bit from you to share your perspective on what are some of the issues that you and your organization are trying to solve.
Yeah, great. Glad to be here with everybody. Sorry to be behind. My wife is expecting any day now, and we thought we were at time to deliver to welcome our newborn, but fortunately we have a couple more days apparently. So my name is Donnel Baird. I'm the CEO and founder of a Climatetech company called BlocPower, and we focus on decarbonizing buildings. The simplest way to think about it is we want to turn existing buildings into Teslas. Teslas are smart. They're all electric. The fossil fuel engines have been ripped out of the vehicle and replaced with all electric engines. We want to do the same thing with hot water systems. with heating systems, with cooling systems, and with gas stoves. We want buildings to be fossil fuel free and entirely 100% all electric. And that is possible from a software and a hardware and a financing standpoint. And so since we can do this, we should do this, because 30% of greenhouse gas emissions, depending on who you ask, 20 to 30% of emissions in America come from buildings. And so some of the barriers, I mean, I could go on and on. There's tons of barriers. When we think about the way America is set up, we think about it as having three sectors: the private sector, the government, state governments, federal governments, local governments, and the third sector being the citizenship sector. We're like voters, and we send our kids to school, and we have parent teachers associations, or we have houses of worship, or we're a member of the Sierra Club or NRDC. Is where we live our civic life. So those are the three sectors of American society. And citizens, you know, over 60% of us are alarmed about climate change. We're ready to do something right now. But the government and the private sector are lagging. The government can't get to a federal deal. And the private sector, in our view, is focused on many of the wrong solutions. And it's not clear that the existing technology innovation industry or financial services industry are really prepared to provide the kind of patient, risk-tolerant capital at scale that we actually need to drive innovation in terms of deployment, in terms of development of hardware and software, and distributing those technologies across our society. So we don't have the political mandate that we need. We don't have the capital in the right forms to unlock the kind of innovation and entrepreneurship that's needed to scale these solutions up. I'll close on this part by saying at BlocPower, you know, we're at the intersection of several troglodyte, highly regulated industries. So the real estate industry, the utility industry, neither is known for being like an early adopter. The construction industry is the one industry in America where the efficiency per worker has actually like declined over the last few decades instead of increased. And so these are highly fragmented, inefficient, highly regulated, often monopoly industries, and they're hard to innovate. They're some of the slowest adopters of technology in America. And so, you know, we've got our work cut out for us. But we've been learning a lot about BlocPower, about how to decarbonize buildings in the real world and get this stuff done.
So it's a really good overview. And you know, and one of the things that we discussed when the panelists got together a week ago was this concept of the trilemma, right? That there's a lot of things that you need to balance here as you look at decarbonization, right? It's decarbonization itself, it's the affordability of that decarbonization. And then there's also equity, and how do we ensure that both the most impacted populations are considered in this, as well as that everybody is able to take part in the investments related to energy transition. And Donnel, how do you and your company think about that is around balancing those three areas?
Well, I think that, I mean, Tina, your question includes a premise that it's even remotely possible to make progress without equity. And I don't believe that it is. We see in the policy arena that because we have not made the investments in West Virginia to bring West Virginians on board with the clean energy economy, we cannot pass a damn thing. And so this idea that you can move the clean energy economy forward without being inclusive of former coal miners in West Virginia or Southern Ohio or Black and brown communities, working class white communities across the country, you're just not going to be able to pass anything in terms of legislation, nor will you be able to scale software or hardware deployment across American society without mass market adoption that will come from these communities. And so affordability and inclusion go hand in hand. And I don't really see a pathway to decarbonizing anything unless inclusion is the very first step. I got into an argument with a Silicon Valley investor, I won't say who it is, in Silicon Valley, and they're like, well, Donnel, we're going to innovate, we're going to invest, just like Tesla. Like, we're going to start with like a $200,000 product, and then we're going to bring the cost down to $100,000, and then after that, we'll bring it down to $30,000, where poor people like yourself and your family can afford it, and eventually, like, clean energy will like trickle down to you right through the economy, and that's how our system is set up. But that's not going to work. That's not going to allow us to deploy clean energy and decarbonize our society in the next 8 years. That's not going to work. So our view is that this very idea that there is some kind of pathway forward without prioritizing inclusion, we think it's a faulty premise. But we do think that policy and financial markets are predicated on that faulty premise. And that's a primary challenge that we all face in terms of how to save the planet.
There was some really, really good points there. Paige, let me bring you in here. How do you all think about this and addressing these same kind of issues and balancing that Donnel just laid out?
Yeah, thank you, Donnel. That was yes, we can't do it. I think one of the things, it's interesting, as Matt mentioned just maybe a week or so ago, there was something on Energy Twitter, a stark chart that showed kind of a gradient of who the countries that were responsible for the most emissions were the highest emitters, and then kind of juxtaposed to the countries that are most impacted by the emissions. And it's nearly opposite, right? So here's kind of the Northern Hemisphere emitting, and this is moving beyond the US, looking globally, much of the Southern Hemisphere dramatically impacted by climate change and emissions. So the notion that we can do this without thinking about equity and sort of how we're all interconnected, and how we have to make these decisions, not just around replacing GHG, but also how do we think about the impact, is, you're absolutely right, Donnel. It's required. Otherwise, we're not going to solve the big problem. We're going to solve small problems like a few people buying Teslas, which is great. Happy that they did that, but that's not going to change the whole thing. So in my mind, one of the things that we can do to bring this along, there's an overarching story that I think our industry needs to get a lot better at, shall we say, communicating or explaining how these things are all interrelated. I think, Donnel, you mentioned, the civic, the government, and the private. And I think in order to engage the civic community who wants to say we need to decarbonize, climate's important, and have them be able to put the pressure basically on government and private to make the right calls, we need to enable the civic community to have recommendations to understand the problem, to be able to say, and this is how we move forward, and this is what we want, and this is what we're asking for. Because when we can put that kind of pressure on, when we can tell those stories in a digestible way to our community members, then we can apply a different type of pressure with a clearer path forward and a clearer ask to the private and government sector. So that's one thing I think is probably underrated, is the necessary required. Yeah.
100% correct.
Okay, good. We didn't even plan that. Agreed. Okay, good. But yeah, we do need to work on sort of communication and storytelling. And then I think the other piece that can help is, again, this transparency and like tracking and emissions, so that we know and we can point to where the sources of challenges are. So I think information, I think removing the asymmetry of information, making it easier to understand what your emissions profile is, making it easier to understand kind of the polluters and whatever is going on. So I think there is opening up the information asymmetry, and I think there is enabling our communities with better communication and storytelling.
And Matt, as you look at innovations in this sector too, how do you take into account kind of a more global perspective? Like, are there innovations coming from emerging economies that can be leveraged on a global scale?
There certainly are, and we look for the innovations anywhere. We have portfolio companies across 3 continents. I wish it was 4 or 5, and at some point, hopefully, it will be. But it's at least spread out at some point right now. And we always look at the global market because these are global problems. Some of the biggest emission problems, like we talked about rice, it's not a U.S. problem. And we are working really hard to find investments to make in that sector, and we partner with folks in Asia in that case to try to find those solutions. And our particular criteria is we only invest in markets where we think there's a 0.5 gigaton of annual impact potential, which you rarely get there looking at just the US. So we're looking at the entire market. A lot of times with cooling, we're trying to think about let's do something that will work in Asia for the cooling problem. And I completely agree, with something that Donnel said, and this is core to many of our investment theses, which is, I mentioned at the beginning that we need strong government action. And the way to get government action is to make people see the benefits for them. And the benefits might be things that affect them today, like clean air, like safety, like comfortable homes, like cheap transportation when gas is skyrocketing, and all these kinds of things that will make their lives comfortable, happier, better, more affordable. And when everyone feels that the energy transition is for them and for them now, they'll be supporters of it, both as consumers and as voters, which is incredibly important. Where I do see things somewhat differently is in some cases, the technologies will start out more expensive. Just like Tesla, the reason we could try to think about the Tesla buildings is because Tesla got successful by selling a very expensive car first. It just wouldn't have worked to have made a $15,000 electric sedan at the beginning. The time value of carbon does matter. I'm always talking about this to anyone who will listen. I would be just as excited to invest in a company personally that was going to have a 100 or 200 megaton impact if it could do it in 3 years, as I would be in a gigaton company that's going to do it in 20 years. Because a molecule of carbon emitted today, as compared to 20 years from now, is much more important. That molecule has all that time to increase tipping effects, to melt the ice, to do ecological and economic damage. So time does matter in these things. And there are some problems that we need technical solutions that are just going to start out expensive. BE, we call that the green premium. And we, then look for other sources of capital and ways to buy that down. Maybe it's an expensive market niche. Maybe it's government efforts. Maybe it's corporates who really care about this stuff and they're willing to pay more in the short term because they want carbon credits, or they want to increase employee retention and morale because their employees talk about that. There's all kinds of ways to try to find to buy down that green premium until technologies get cheap. And then there are places where there is no green premium and you don't have to worry about it. And then, we should be deploying to everyone and to the folks who need it most.
No, thanks. And I think that's a really good point too. And so Donnel, I wanted to go back to one of the things that you mentioned here, which is around, when we look at areas like that have transitioning communities, like in West Virginia, what do you see as some of the most impactful ways that we can actually help make that transition? So as we know, like 1 megawatt of coal does not have the same number of jobs from a coal plant as in 1 megawatt of wind. So how do we think about helping those communities transition in a way that can actually get a bit more of that political capital to drive the transition more broadly?
Well, the coal jobs pay better than the solar jobs or the wind jobs, right? So coal has helped West Virginians send their kids to college and be, middle class or low middle class for generations. And they pay more money to the coal workers than the wind jobs and the solar jobs do. And so, that's part of the problem that's happening there. And so, in the clean energy sector, we like to say, well, there's so many more energy efficiency jobs and there's so many more solar jobs and the growth rate in our industry is so much higher. Yeah, but the actual unit economics of the jobs are poor, right? Solar jobs pay a lot less than wind jobs, and wind jobs pay a lot less than coal jobs. And so if you're a West Virginian trying to make ends meet and send your kid to college, you can do that with coal. You can't do that with solar. Wind, I know less about, but my understanding is that it's better than solar, but less than coal. So that's one problem. When I was in India and we talked to the CEO of Tata, Indian multinational conglomerate, to kind of circle back to two questions, like they did have a low cost electric vehicle that they produced in India for Indians to use. And they built it for the Indian middle class. And so I think there are things that are unique to the American style of innovation, driven by, VC and angel investments and, rich people and the kinds of things they're interested in. And, And then they fund those things, built by entrepreneurs who are similar to them and went to the same schools and eat at the same clubs or whatever, right? So I think there are things, the output of innovation in the US is different. But yeah, I mean, 10 years ago, we were in India, my Columbia Business School class, and we were in the low cost electric vehicle that Tata Motors had built, right? Now that would not fit into our American style of innovation, right? But in India, they were able to innovate and get it done. So I think that there are different kinds of frameworks that we can learn from India and China and Africa and other places that can help us solve our problems here in America, so that we can actually lead the globe in innovating in clean energy, which is what must happen. But if we can figure out how to do it in a collaborative fashion with an open mind and with a view towards actually developing new structures as opposed to the existing structure where it's like, hey, we got to make a bunch of these people rich and we have like a narrow set of gatekeepers to innovation. Like, what does it look and feel like to really have the most talented people in the world incentivized to build climate tech? And if they do it, that they would have the expectation that they would have capital to scale their business, whatever it is. Like, given the scale of the climate crisis, why wouldn't that be our approach? So I do think when I like testify to Congress and stuff like that, or when we talk to Senator Manchin's staff, there are very real political constraints. But part of those, we have to look in the mirror as the clean energy sector and say, how would things be different if we had actually invested in West Virginia, geothermal, wind, whatever it is, battery manufacturing in West Virginia, so that we had built enough high-paying jobs in West Virginia so that we could ensure that we would get a vote, not for 1.5 or 555 billion of clean energy incentives, but that we could actually get 2 trillion or 3 trillion. And that's the spread of what we would have been able to pump into the clean energy economy had we actually invested it in the right communities, in the right place with the right mindset. But we haven't done that, so we're stuck with what we got.
No, that's great. And Matt, how do you think about like some of these concepts in terms of investing in these spaces today? Like, what are things that we can be doing differently and changing to ensure that we do drive that equity and kind of the fruits of our investments as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't claim to be a policy expert, and I don't really want to get into a debate on whether just rich venture capitalists are supporting, things for themselves or not. I don't really think that's a productive debate. But I do think, from our perspective, every innovation we see that we want to back has to get up to 0.5 gigaton. So that's 1% of emissions. So if we don't see the market getting that big for something, if there's not, a segment of emissions that are that large and a technology that we think can really scale, those are the two things that kind of get to it. Is this emissions category a really big category? I'll give you an example of one that's not. I looked at a really cool company that I loved, excellent team, excellent product in the chocolate space a few months ago. Man, I wanted to do that deal. I love this team. I thought the product was amazing. We had a really fun taste testing exercise at home with my wife and kids with, their different little chocolate treats. And it was a completely, fermented chocolate product. It wasn't from cocoa beans. But I think chocolates, may be responsible for 100 to 150 megatons. So even if that company took over the entire chocolate market, it wouldn't be the kind of impact that we seek. They raised money. I'm really happy they did, because that's still a big problem. As we talked about before, we need to solve all these problems. And 100 megaton problems, as you know, is 1 gigaton problem. So that's a big deal. And a lot of the things, one thing that I love about so many of these problems that we solve, that one is an example, is they have so many other negative effects besides the carbon. We're destroying rainforest in order to grow chocolate. So, next time you eat a chocolate bar, you're contributing to environmental destruction. I'm not saying that you shouldn't eat that, but that's a fact. Same thing with coffee, with a million other comforts and so forth that we have. So, one thing I love to think about and talk about is, and this comes from a political cartoon that's, I saw way back in the early days of this whole journey, was there were all these people, and the world was like, had turned into this beautiful sunny place, and energy was cheap and free, and the air and the water were clean, and we weren't cutting down the forests. And the punchline was, turns out climate change wasn't real. And we created this amazing, incredible world with all these benefits, even though climate change wasn't real. You know, back in 2006, that was like a thing that, you know, some people still talked about, that it wasn't real. We know now, you know, as we knew then, but it's more accepted now that it is. But almost every technology that we think about is going to improve the lives for everybody, not just humans, but every living thing on the planet, which you know, makes, I think, this work all the more important and gratifying to be a part of.
No, thanks, Matt. And I'm seeing a lot of questions come through for all of the panelists. And before we get to kind of the Q&A, we do have a lot of asks from everyone online today to understand a bit better from all of you. How did you get to kind of where you are today in your journey? There are a lot of folks here on the line who would love to, you know, work in climate and sustainability long term. And so they just want to understand what inspires you. How did you get to what where you are today, and what advice you might have? So Matt, maybe I'll just start with you then to kind of take us through a little bit of what your journey has been.
Yeah, well, my journey was, I wrote a paper in the 6th grade saying that I wanted to work at Genentech. I wanted to work on biotechnology. It was this incredibly cool new technology, and I wanted to help people be healthier. So I focused on biotech. You know, fast forward 15, 20 years later, I was working at Genentech. And by that point, it seemed like the biggest problem facing the world was climate change. So in 2006, I quit my job and went surfing and teaching English in Central America for a couple of months, came back and beat the streets for a role, and started working in Climatetech. So, you know, I think people are on this call because they probably already agree with me in that assessment that this is the most important problem. Like, this is it. And as we talked about a moment ago, solving this problem will solve so many other problems. Access to energy, for example, war, you know, is a huge driver. Fossil fuels is a huge driver of bad governments and wars. Air pollution, and it's, you know, it's killing millions of people, all these kinds of things. So I think you're on this call because you want to work on that, and I commend you, and I think you're doing the right thing. And then I would say, go where your interests are. You know, we've talked about how there's a gazillion climate problems. You don't have to go work on the 1 or 2 gigaton problems if that's not your thing, if you don't have the right skills. If you do, go do it. But, you know, if you're into food, go work on chocolate. You know, if you're into architecture, get an architecture degree and design sustainable buildings. You know, if you like to work with your hands, go get trained as a mechanic to work on EVs. You know, I don't know what it is, but find your passion and your skill set and figure out what are the relevant challenges to this problem that you can attack with that skill set and get to work.
Great, thanks, Matt. Paige?
Yeah, I think just to be very honest, I did not have as inspiring of a start. There wasn't a deep guiding light from the beginning of my career where I said, I'm going to solve climate. I was like, I want to have a good job. I want to be in business. I didn't aspire from the very beginning. And I found myself just, you know, kind of working in finance and had a friend who happened to say, I think I'm going to try to make clean energy. And I thought, well, that sounds great. If you can pay me, maybe I'll come do that. Like, I think making the world better is a good thing, but that wasn't my career driver. So again, like Matt, I commend those who have seen the call to action and want to make the change. But even if that wasn't always at your heart of heart, I think my experience was I kind of fell into this because of course I want to make the world better. And I believe that solving climate is great, but that I didn't see the connection between my professional career and my involvement in climate until much later in my career. So you can pursue something that doesn't look directly related to climate because it's interesting and you're learning, and then you will learn a way to kind of weave those things together. My background in kind of finance and economics helped me understand how we can make, you know, the price of energy and solar sort of tenable for homeowners. which helped adoption of residential solar. So I didn't set out looking to make that connection, but I was open to it when it was there. So I think my learning is just when you're curious, follow it, and the lines and the connections will come over your career. I think the second trend, if I were to look back at kind of how I've accelerated my learning and my ability to make impact in what is now Climatetech, it's around just jumping in and not just sitting in an office and sort of reading white papers, but like getting out in my early career, like doing a bunch of ride-alongs with solar panel installers and understanding what was on their mind, like going to South Africa and understanding the realities of the grid. So I think the closer you can get to the problem, like the real problem, the people that are impacted, the people that are like, turning wrenches, the better empathy you'll have, the better understanding you'll have for the drivers. So I guess my two themes are don't feel like you need to be on a certain direct path, because mine certainly wasn't like that. Follow your curiosity and make the connections. And the second theme is like try to get deep in there and get the empathy so that you can understand what's happening and where the unlocks are.
Great, thanks, Paige. Donnel, what about you? What has led you to kind of where you are today as a CEO of this company?
I have children, and I'm very concerned about the planet that they're going to live on. And so I don't have particular technical skills, or I wasn't that good in business school. I like failed a class, which is really hard to do in business school. Like they don't even fail people, but I failed one. And well, I was trying to start my business. So I was skipping class, and there's a final exam, and I had to go down to the White House to try to get some seed capital to launch my company. And I skipped the final exam. The professor failed me, whatever. I'm still angry at him. So I work backwards from the climate crisis and what's needed to delay and intervene in the climate crisis. Like I'm not someone who's like, follow your dreams here. That wouldn't be my message. Like, I am not necessarily qualified to like run my business and build my business, but it doesn't matter to me because I have a kid, right? Like I have to do what needs to be done to invest my life in the maximum amount of decarbonization that I can, so that I can look my kids and hopefully grandkids in the eye and say, look, grandpa did literally everything that he knew how to do to maximize decarbonization. So that's what I'm about. Before we started our business, we had to raise some capital. We met with 200 investors. All of them told us no over 18 months. Then we had to raise another round, same thing. We met with the Department of Energy. It's been a difficult road building BlocPower. The thing that keeps me going is that we're working backwards from what needs to happen to resolve the climate crisis with all of the skills and abilities and resources that we can grab onto. And that's what we're about. Given the scale of the climate crisis, that is what I would encourage all of you to be about.
So this is great. I think three different paths to get to where you are all today. And so hopefully a lot for folks on the phone to listen to and see hopefully their own path to making this kind of change as well. So I have a long list of questions that have come in from folks, and I'm going to do this a little bit of a free for all. So I'll read the question, and then whoever's excited about answering it, I'm happy to throw it to you. So one of the first is, how do we convince governments across the globe to take this issue more seriously? As we've seen, there are some countries that are taking this a lot more to heart than others. And what has worked well to improve government support in the past decade? I'll leave that open if anybody wants to take that one.
Well, I'd say two things. One, we talked about voters, inspiring voters to care about this issue, either because they have the long-term view that Donnel just espoused, which is if you understand climate change and you're thinking about the current generation growing up, it's hard not to see it that way. Hopefully more will. And the other is just to make the impact of the energy transition felt for people, so it makes their lives better on a day-to-day basis. And then the second part is governments respond to money and investment flows. and those sorts of things. So, we need to show governments that there is a massive economic opportunity for their people with regard to jobs, for the investors and capital flows that make large investments happen, and for their tax bases. We need states to be really excited about competing for clean energy jobs and having clean energy research parks and fighting to get clean energy factories and those sorts of things. And those things come from the flows of capital. So I think that's important too, is to show people that the clean energy transition is not only going to make our lives better, but it can work economically.
One other thing I'd add is, and we can't rely on the countries that feel, in my experience, the countries that feel the pain of climate change the most acutely are those who are making the changes, the real changes, because it's not like in a few years, this is going to be really hard for your citizens. It's like, and I'll use South Africa as an example, like people regularly on a day-to-day basis do not have power. There are, blackouts for 4 hours a day, every day. So when you say, do you think you have an energy problem? You're not convincing. You're not convincing the government. You're not sort of proving that there's value, proving that there's economic value. You're actually solving an immediate and acute problem for their constituents, for their community. And those places can be lighthouses. In my mind, hopefully we don't have to take advantage of the acute pain, but you don't need to convince the government, where they are leaning forward and they're like, we have a problem. What do we need to do? Do we need to change policy? How do we invest? When we focus our time there, we can move more quickly. And ideally, I think we can use those places as lighthouses of innovation. And look what happens when you lean forward. Look what happens when you change policy. Look what happens when you do this. So when I think about kind of where to spend time on the government piece, it's like, let's go where the door is open instead of to where the door is closed. And let's make big dramatic changes with the folks that are ready and willing to do that. And the folks that are still like, how, prove it to me, what does this mean? We'll come back to them later, because our time can be well spent actually proving the value instead of convincing.
Well, and Paige, let me follow up with you on this. There was another question that came through the chat that since you mentioned kind of South Africa and the power grid there, as we look at countries around the world that are starting to develop and really building their economies and really growing their power sectors, a lot of that might come with increased heavy fossil fuel use as they move up a development curve. And so, but at the same time, is it unfair for those of us in the developed world to say, well, no, you shouldn't do that, as they're trying to grow their economies and lift people out of poverty? How do we think about that balance, and what can we do to help them continue to develop economically, while also not, making sure that they don't bear the costs associated with, say, leapfrogging heavy fossil fuel use? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, that is the reality. So what we don't like to talk about is when folks are, in Chile, when they're removing the coal plants, they're replacing what they need on the grid for stability with diesel generators. That's what they're doing. So yes, it's a great tagline to say we're decommissioning coal, but if you actually look at what's happening, they're creating, well, first of all, it's an economic divide, because the folks who can afford to create their own power at their home are buying their own generator, which typically is diesel right now. And so now we're having the net effect, the opposite net effect that we want. And in fact, maybe it's even worse. So that is not an optimistic statement, but that's a very real statement, that in transitioning to carbon-free energy, there are the wrong choices along the way. And I think the way we manage that with investment and policy is absolutely critical. And this, I think, probably gets to Donnel's earlier point that there is no decarbonization without equity, because otherwise the folks who are trying to decarbonize, their solution, their financial solution, is oftentimes going to be alternative, also, sort of fossil fuel or dirty generation. So this is where we need to bring in investment. We need to bring in insights. And I look at what happened in response to COVID, to take a slightly tangent in terms of getting a vaccine, where we sort of said, like, we have to solve this problem, and the finance and the R&D came together. And to me, this is what we need to do. A similar approach, and I suppose history will be the judge of if that was a productive approach in the end. But the fact that we could come together from a finance and from a R&D and from a deployment perspective, and in under a year create a vaccine that has addressed the problem. We need that type of solution to help some of these transitions and from an investment and deployment perspective. Because I think you're right, Tina, it's a really challenging problem, particularly for those that feel the pain the most acutely.
Well, just to add quickly, I mean, this stuff isn't like theoretical or even ethical or moral. I mean, just geopolitically, like one of my friends is making a film about the Harvard or MIT professor in Cambridge who's into geoengineering and his like partnership with the dude in Bangladesh who's like, well, Bangladesh is already experiencing climate change. We got floods, droughts. We already have all of it in Bangladesh. We're already there. And nobody in Bangladesh contributed to global emissions to the climate crisis. So Bangladesh is already suffering, and they're suffering the most, and they didn't contribute. And they're like, it's too late to, I mean, any intervention that shows up now is already too late for it. So why wouldn't Bangladesh do geoengineering? Like, what's to stop them with the Harvard professor and the guy from firing the geoengineering rockets up into the sky to geoengineer? Because from the perspective of Bangladesh, like that's the best chess move that they have. And year over year, more and more countries are gonna add on that list. And so this idea that, like we're gonna like solve this, but we're gonna expect the people on Bangladesh to just like wait around until we figure it out through our system, they're not gonna sit around and wait it around. Somebody's gonna try to do some geoengineering, and God knows what the downstream impacts of that are. So I could complain all day. I think that what we got to do is take the best practices from Wall Street. Like, there's a lot of things about Wall Street that I think are terrible. There's a lot of things about Silicon Valley that are terrible. I've worked in the government. I worked for Barack Obama. There's a lot of stuff that's like terrible. There's a lot of stuff that's great. What we got to do is like sift through a lot of the crap and figure out what the best practices are that truly drive innovation, right? That unlock genius level talent, no matter your race, gender, age, whatever. If you want to work on climate, we're going to get you some capital because it's all hands on deck. And we are going to have a policy approach that is all hands on deck, right? And we're going to unlock innovation from the citizenship sector to allow people to plug into solutions at scale. And we gotta take best practices from Silicon Valley and Wall Street and the government and the citizenship sector, or else we don't have a real shot. And so what I'm pushing for is to make sure that we don't get trapped in old structures that have been handed down from prior generations and are just the received inherited wisdom, even business wisdom or policy wisdom, but are 100% inappropriate for actually confronting an existential crisis, the likes of which we've never seen. And too often what I see and what it really worries me is that we aren't willing to innovate in our financial and policy and political and citizenship structures. We aren't willing to do the hard work of tearing down the old, basically useless and failed models that haven't helped us decarbonize at scale in order to build the new models that actually will help us decarbonize. And so I would just push all of us to have the courage to take a hard look at what actually needs to be done and to do every damn thing we can to move that ball forward.
Well, and Donnel, let me ask you then, I think the last question that we got from our Q&A was around like, how do we know if we succeed? So there's, how do we know that we've successfully decarbonized, but not only successfully decarbonized, that we've done it in an equitable way? What are the things we need to be looking for to know if we're on the right track?
Well, I think one of the things that's interesting about the Joe Biden administration, and I love them and I love the policy and I love what they're trying to do. They have this thing called the Justice 40 initiative, whereby 40% of all the money that the government is investing in infrastructure, and heaven help us that Manchin signs off on $500 billion for climate, which we expect to happen. But 40% of that is supposed to be invested in low-income communities, and the entire United States federal government is supposed to be reorganized to predict and track investments at scale in clean energy and clean infrastructure across the United States. And so we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars being invested in communities that need environmental justice and communities that need equity. And so there's a lot of mapping that's being done. For example, we have a project with Jeff Bezos, and he's actually into it. And I spoke with him a month or two ago about it. And we're building a digital map of all 125 million buildings in America. And all of the buildings that are in low and moderate income communities, we are tagging as communities and buildings in need of environmental justice. And on a building by building basis, we're going to offer a free decarbonization plan to every resident and every owner of every one of those buildings. Now, that is not only going to help the building owner understand what they need to do to decarbonize, who's the contractor, what kind of hardware, what size, what brand. It also is going to help the building owner, the tenants, the contractors, the local government that's getting billions of dollars of stimulus money that they need to figure out how to invest. Well, which buildings should they invest in and how? Should they buy heat pumps? Should they buy geothermal? Should they buy European geothermal, which Matt pointed out, like they're better than we are at it. So maybe we should set up some, city of Chicago should bring in somebody from Europe to do geothermal on the south side of Chicago. There's a lot of really technical and financial and policy decisions that have to be made in a really decentralized fashion. How can we use software and hardware to help guide citizens across the country towards the task of decarbonizing 125 million buildings over the next eight years? So I think that's one example of the kind of thing we can do. I think in other roles, like the other panelists have the ability to look at different parts of the economy and different parts of the globe. As an entrepreneur, I can look at my one problem, like how do we decarbonize buildings and come up with a plan to do that? And how do we decarbonize buildings in an equitable way? Because if we don't have a plan to do it equitably, we're never going to get the government resources and build up the workforce and do the things that we need to do to actually implement at scale. And so that's how we think about it.
Matt, Paige, anything else from you on what success looks like here, or parting thoughts?
Well, I was just skimming through the questions. There's a lot of really interesting and good questions. I wish we had time to answer them all. And many of them are about these big picture questions of like policy and motivating people to work on the problems and so forth. And those, I think about those things, but they're not really, they're not my specialty. So, my opinion would just be one of another random person commenting on them. But I go back to this, what success looks like is the energy transition as it gains steam, as it becomes successful, is just going to make people's lives better on a daily basis. Whether it's South Africans not having blackouts because there are local microgrids, or reducing the incredible particulate emissions from diesel generators in Chile, or the high cost of energy in a lot of really crappy U.S. public buildings. That makes me think of like one thing. So many of those buildings have single pane windows, which are almost holes in the wall. Not quite, but almost. And we need a good technology to replace them. There's so many of these things, and then we need lots of people to go out and replace them. And these are kinds of the areas that folks are investing in. We've got a company that's making vacuum insulated glass windows that can be retrofitted into single pane frames, for example, and go up to R13. Turn those holes into walls. And there's just a million of these companies. There's so many little problems and niches. And I love that there's a lot of people on this call and that you're inspired about it. I think just go start working on it. Do your part.
Yeah, I think the last thing, the how do we measure success is, to me, one of the biggest questions, because it's very easy to defer and say, we're going to be carbon free by 2050. And every single person who's written that policy is going to be retired or maybe dead by 2050. So easy for them to say that, right? Good luck, everybody. You guys on this call, you got this, right? And I think we have to stop that. I mean, I'm very happy that people are making policies, but to say that you're going to be carbon free by 2050 or 2040 or even 2030 is like not going to do it. Like it's way too late. And those types of policies do not incent the pace of change that we need. So to me, when I think about what is success in the short term, it's pulling those accountability metrics forward to like the next year or two. Like, what are we going to do now on track? And maybe we take a couple, correct turns, wrongs or rights, but we can't defer change to 2030 or 40 or 50. Like that's done. It's too late. So to me, success in this moment is pulling forward some of our dates and our goals across the industry and making this change, this acceleration happen with a lot more urgency and accountability. And I hope you guys can help us.
I agree with that. That's why we're so proud of the city of Ithaca and some of the other cities we're working with, that they said, screw 2050 goal, like we'll all be dead, right? As Paige said, we're going to do this by 2030. We're going to do this in a way that's accountable, where I, as the mayor, 4 years from now, need to be 50% to decarbonizing my city, which means that 12 months from now, right? Like I have a metric that I need to hit, like 12, 13, 14, 15%, whatever it is, 17%, 17.5. So we want to see those timelines change. I'll bring in something from politics that I think is really important for younger people on the phone. Like the African-American civil rights movement spent a lot of time studying Gandhi. Dr. King met Gandhi, but the architects and lieutenants and like kind of the COO of the civil rights movement was a guy named Jim Lawson, who actually studied Gandhi nonviolence for 3 years at like an ashram in India. And one of the things that came back that really animated the Black civil rights struggle was this Gandhian maxim of you have to be the change that you wish to see in the world. Now, for a lot of us, that means, hey, like I personally am going to go buy a Tesla and like decarbonize my home and like recycle my urine and my food or whatever. And like, that's cool. But really what we got to figure out how to do is be the change, not just for yourself, but that you wish to see out in the world. So how do you introduce changes that can scale and serve other people in their lives? And so people may not have the resources to buy a Tesla. So can they buy a Tata Nano? By the way, the Nano ran into trouble. I think one of them caught on fire or something. So, it's not that everything worked out, but they made a good attempt. So we want to think through, like, how can we as participants and therefore leaders in the climate tech movement contribute, not just for ourselves and the people who are like us, but the people that need to be impacted immediately before they try to geoengineer everything. So I'd offer that.
No, and I think on that stirring call to action, I think we can wrap. I think there's a couple things that we've really heard here today that are important. I think this necessity to like not defer change and start moving on it now. And I also think a point that came up earlier in the panel is really important around that it's a systems perspective, right? We need a multidisciplinary, a multi-industry, approach that goes at all of the different levels of society that Donnel was talking about earlier, the government, the private, the civic, and that we need to start operating across all of them to see the change, which, as we saw at the beginning, is massive. And it's a full sort of recorrection from where we are today. So I thank you all again to our incredible panelists who came here on their Saturday. I was inspired. I'm sure all the other folks on the phone were as well. And with that, and Donnel, good luck and congratulations on the incoming baby. And then with that, I will hand it over to Julia.
Yes, so thank you so much, Tina. And on behalf of everyone here, we wanted to thank each of you